dedicate 10 minutes towards the end of this event, but before I would like briefly to introduce our panelists. So we have Olga Ghassanzadeh. Olga is the chair of the Article 6.4 Mechanism Supervisory Body. And we also have the vice chair, Bai Diagne. We have also two party representatives from Singapore and from Bhutan. We have Rui Yungan, who's senior manager at the National Climate Change Secretariat in Singapore. And Sonan Tashi. Sonan is the chief planning officer at the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources in Bhutan. And also we have two experts who have been closely following this issue and before were very much involved as well in the clean development mechanism. We have Rikita Tiwari. Rikita is senior manager consultant at the Climate Policy and Carbon Pricing organization South Pole, and it's also participating on behalf of Project Developer Forum. And also, last but not least, Jonathan Crook. Jonathan is expert at the global carbon markets at Carbon Market Watch. And I would like to start the conversation around a few guiding facilitative questions. So we're going to have a round of interventions from the panelists assessing ambition, funding, and how will the Article 6.4 mechanism contribute to sustainable development. Let's start talking about ambition. How can the mechanism contribute to raising ambition and ensuring environmental integrity? As we heard from James, these high-quality environmental integrity arrangements will be essential for an effective mechanism. I would like to please ask first Olga. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Thank you and welcome everyone. I have the tough task of being the first to respond and obviously to deliver on ambition mitigation actions. What we would need to do is we need to facilitate scaling up of climate finance. We would need to be accessible and inclusive. And we will need to do so by remaining robust and setting benchmarks, following science, and being dynamic. As for environmental integrity, we often ask this question, and we have guiding principles that the parties gave us in Glasgow. But I also wanted to highlight that integrity is a fundamental principle, and you maintain integrity by opening up yourself to scrutiny. By being transparent in process, in decision making, by having a system of checks and balances, and being self-learning and responding when reacting, when you need to react and you need to be, as I said, you need to be dynamic. And I think that will be very important for us to be a learning mechanism to deliver the best what the parties have tasked us with.
Definitely, this is a learning exercise and a listening exercise, absolutely. I had the chance to plug into the discussions last week, and really, I was amazed by the level of complexity of the discussions, but also the level of honesty. And this was a public, of course, meeting, and delegates echoing also the inputs from the different constituencies were very honest, right? So this is a very honest conversation, and that's also this side event convened by the Supervisory Body is the proof of that openness to discussion. And I would like now to hear from our Vice Chair. Dai, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, colleagues. I will just complement the elements already raised by Olga to ensure the ambition, raising the ambition as well as ensuring environmental integrity. For this mechanism, we need to recall that we have already in Glasgow very clear guidance on how to set up this mechanism, building on more than 30 years under the CDM, as well as other crediting mechanisms. Based on that, we have received very clear guidance on what element to be taken into account to ensure the ambition and the environmental integrity. And first, we'll need to have a broader participation, because the mechanism is here to allow other stakeholders to participate in the Paris Agreement objectives. We have also been tasked to build the mechanism with very stringent rules in terms of environmental integrity, taking into account the baseline, taking into account a shorter crediting period, taking into account, when it comes to the project cycle, all the different steps that ensure that environmental integrity. But most important and new is the involvement of the host country, because the host country was not really involved in setting many elements within the mechanism. In this new one, the host country will be involved in designing the baseline, in defining the crediting period, because to be in line with its NDC. And all of that will contribute to raising the ambition and ensuring the environmental integrity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bai. And now we're going to hear from the perspective of parties. In the case of Bhutan and Singapore, I think it was very smart to invite these two representatives, because we'll have two complementary approach. So I would like to start maybe with Singapore.
Yep. Thank you very much and good afternoon. So from Singapore perspective, I think Article 6.4 mechanism will help to provide the carbon finances that Olga has mentioned just now and mobilize investment in mitigation activities that are additional. So we know that the SB is still working on the methodologies, but we trust that the guidance from Glasgow and Sharm will provide the proper environmental integrity requirements and safeguards to ensure environmental integrity is there and truly can help to advance climate action and ambition. And also on how we can use this to actually to raise ambition is that at the end of the crediting periods, many of the host parties could then accrue the mitigation outcomes towards their future NDC's achievement, hence indirectly raising our climate ambition for the future. Therefore, we should also try to focus a bit on the long term and by putting in place methodologies that could enable higher hanging fruits that may be costlier now. And lastly, I just want to mention that Article 6.4 has a unique feature called Overall Mitigation of Global Emissions, or OMGE. So this actually further enhances the impact of Article 6.4 mechanism as well as its additionality of the units. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, definitely the scope, the potential of the mechanism to help countries deliver in their NDCs is incredibly big, and it's a constant work as well. You know, the implementation of the Article 6.4 mechanism will be already into motion, where new NDCs will have to be in a few years to be presented. And now let's hear from the representative from Bhutan, Sonam. What is it your perspective on how the mechanism can help raise ambition?
Thank you, Judith. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So, I think one, without showing any preference to who might on the panel, but I think I would just like to add to what Mbaye just added also that, and just want to draw on this is from developing that also least developed country perspective. You know how we see Article 6.4 as one. How do we really ensure that the Paris Agreement, is the achievements that we make sure that it's taken to the highest possible extent of implementation, and want to draw attention to paragraph 4, Article 4, paragraph 16, where it really talks about that countries, parties, all organizations, regional organizations can engage in joint action together to achieve Para 2, that is the NDC. And this is where we see the 6.4 mechanism as instrumental in allowing such regional cooperation. And based on this, we also need to see how, as Mbaye mentioned, the CDM, everything has the good and the bad. There are valuable lessons that we can learn from CDM. My country and a few others that, where we are familiar with has benefited from this. And I think this is where To raise ambition also, we need to have a reference point, and we should see what were the good things that we can learn from CDM and take forward. And then on, besides this policy level of raising ambition, just want to get into some of the ground implementation on the field. One, the mechanism is most likely going to allow, and I think it will, the private sector to be engaged in achieving our ambitions. And this is really largely how do you mobilize private sector capital, private sector investments in getting the cooperative mechanism up and running. And also for countries where, what people call in the development world donor fatigue, there's limited resources, but the needs are never ending, it's always expanding. And this is where we can look towards the mechanism in financing for development for many countries, including mine. I mean, for instance, just some numbers, which, and you can imagine what will be for bigger countries. We need $3.5 billion to achieve some of our long-term strategies, emission, and so far we've only raised $200 million. So where does the rest come from, right? Even the most generous donor on earth isn't going to do that for you. We have to learn. So this is where we see a mechanism as a means of letting countries independently, through cooperative approaches, using the market mechanism to achieve finances and all. And another thing about raising ambition is this, again, from Bhutan's experience is this, as we signed up to the Paris Agreement and as we're discussing on how to implement Article 6, it's leading to a key change in certain key ministries. Like in my case, I was in the economic ministry before, it's now the energy and that. We are now thinking not just from a trade or industry point of view, we are thinking from an environmental ambition point of view also. And this is what's leading to a very critical thinking, I would say, in my country, that where the economic sector, we are no longer looking at it just, growth, but we're also seeing that, an opportunity for us to reorient our economic, trade, and industry policies, to align with this global ambition that we have here. So I'll stop over here. I think 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really think it's really inspiring to hear you because of the experiences that you have collected from the Clean Development Mechanism, and it's really good to see that there is an across the board in terms of very many ministries working together to make the best of this opportunity. And now let's going to turn to the experts, and I would like to start with Ritika. Ritika, we were just having a chat before, and yeah, we were sharing how exciting these conversations are. We have the impressions we are at the beginning of something very big in terms of what it can bring, right, in mitigation goals, but also development objectives.
Yeah, that's correct, and thank you for giving us this forum. My name is Ritika. Perhaps I introduce myself because we may not be as it may not be very clear to everyone who we are. I'm Ritika Tiwari. I work for South Pole. We are one of the largest carbon project developers in the world, and also an impact-driven climate company. We have about 1,200 plus experts sitting in around 30 plus offices globally, working on developing carbon projects, but also servicing governments and public sector and private sector clients on the entire value chain of carbon services, so to say. On this panel, I don another hat as South Pole is a member of the Project Developer Forum, which is an expert group or a global association of companies, practitioners, as well as investors in climate action projects. For the question at hand, I think I would like to sort of restate the sentiment that was across the table, that there are in the nuts and bolts of the Paris rule, of the Article 6 rule book, already defines, gives clear guidelines on what is needed, on what needs to be done when designing the mechanism to ensure that environmental integrity objectives are met and ambition is raised, right? Perhaps I mentioned two which have not been mentioned before. For us, for example, a levy on OMGE, which basically ensures that only 98% of the issued credits are actually going to a buyer, and 2% get cancelled for a clear mitigation objective already, for example, is one of the examples and one of the first examples where we're moving away from the sort of the design of the CDM into a mechanism that actually ensures ambition raising, ensures environmental integrity. Same is with allowing corresponding adjustments for both when developing projects both within and outside the scope of NDC. So, and the other things that panelists mentioned around around methodologies, around baseline setting. So in the rule book itself, in our view, there are very clear ways in which this instrument would raise ambition and ensure environmental integrity, which we have not seen before in previous compliance instruments. But if I may sort of zoom out a little bit and think about carbon crediting instruments in general, these instruments are built on the principles of improve and evolve, right? So doing better, continuous improvement, responding to latest science is embedded in these instruments, and I think that in itself is a marker to ensure that carbon markets stand for environmental integrity, at least in principle, right? And from a private sector perspective, I think the private sector is already, as I said, very excited about Article 6, very excited about taking this conversation forward and supporting countries in their mitigation objectives. And we have already been doing that with independent centers, standards, with ambitious first-moving governments, both and I mean we have Singapore sitting in on this table, who has been doing some great work from a perhaps a buyer country perspective. There are also early moving developing countries who have been taking this conversation forward. And I think a new UN standard would actually help us take this conversation forward and define some of the elements that have been that we all have been thinking about for the last few years. Things around how do you align methodologies with the Paris Agreement? How do you set baselines? What does it mean for when you are actually developing a project, and how do you recce it with and confirm what does it mean for the host country in implementing its NDC? How do you go beyond? So all these aspects are we are really closely following this conversation, and we are hoping that that these discussions actually help us, all of us in this market, to actually steer forward, right, in developing an instrument that that has shown that it can credibly generate financing for carbon projects at a micro scale, you know.
Absolutely, Rikitika. Thank you very much for this comprehensive explanation. I think that one can read the enthusiasm in your words, and I am very happy to see that there are interfaces with the private investors that can convey the importance of a UN-based or certified or labeled mechanism that can provide a reliable way of achieving mitigation outcomes. And last but not least, and Jonathan, well, you have the benefit of closing this first round of interventions. So from your perspective and the Carbon Watch, Market Watch perspective, how do you see the potential for mitigation ambition raising?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think first it's important to kind of zoom out a little bit at the bigger picture and recall that this is a system that's initially designed for offsetting, whether that's because the credits could be used towards NDCs or towards company targets, towards airlines under CORSIA. So I think you need to think about whether or not there's a risk it could undermine ambition. So that's something I think in a broader framing to keep in mind. But I think to ensure that it doesn't undermine ambition, you need to ensure that the 6.4 mechanism isn't just a repeat of the CDM, so not a CDM 2.0, and it's also not a copy-paste of VCM with a few changes here and there. There are some very widespread problems currently on the voluntary market with regard to overcrediting, additionality, a lot of other issues. So I think there's some clarity there, and the 6.4 RMPs give some actual hooks as to what needs to be done to ensure baseline setting is ambitious. So I think that's sort of one key part here is on baselines. We need to have ambitious baseline setting in 6.4, and these should be revised and reviewed regularly, for instance, every 5 years, which would align with the crediting cycle for reduction projects. I think also the idea of a baseline contraction factor is an important one that should be implemented, and I know that the Supervisory Body has been debating this quite a bit, but that has requested the Secretariat to do further work on this, so I would welcome that going forward. There's also discussions of dynamic baselines on the voluntary market, so that's also an area that could reduce some of the overcrediting by having baselines set not by the project developers themselves, but by or independent way of doing that. And I think also an additionality. A little bit concerned that there's so much talk of positive lists already in the 6.4 Supervisory Body discussions. This is something that could create a lot of problems, and it has happened in the past. So I think there needs to be more reflection on negative lists, on excluding activity types. I think in the context of the Supervisory Body, it's to there's alignment with the long-term temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. This means not all activities will be eligible or will qualify. And so that's something to keep in mind. And just one last point on OMGE, just to say 2% is pretty low. I think some will recall that there were proposals that this would be much higher than 2%. And also just to say that for the mitigation contribution units, there's no corresponding adjustment that's applied to the 2% OMGE, which means that it's not actually truly OMGE. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for signaling at the pain points in the discussion. Absolutely, we need to cover all those as the conversation moves forward. And now we're going to get into finance. I mean, we hear it in the formal negotiation, we hear it in the non-party stakeholders' statements, we hear it in the streets. The money is not there, the money is not flowing, either for adaptation or for mitigation. And putting money on the table and mobilizing the financial flows for implementing the NDCs. It's also what the mechanisms is there for, right? So I would like now to throw the next question to the table. How can the Article 6.4 mechanism contribute to scaling up funding for mitigation action? And I am going to follow the same order as before. So Olga, what is it that you think the Article 6.4 mechanism can contribute in this field?
Well, I think the first task and first action we can take to scale up finance is to rapidly operationalize the mechanism so that the projects start happening, so that finance start flowing. We already mentioned the need for inclusivity, for broad reach, and indeed, we need to we need to remove barriers. We need to reach the places that are hard to reach. And let's face it, the cost of finance in the developing world is very different to the cost of finance in the developed world. And these are the barriers that we need to address with the help of carbon finance.
Thank you, Olga. The risking climate action investment. I mean, this is, it should be top on the agendas. And in a few days now in Paris, we are going to hear a lot about reforming the financial system so that it can serve the climate crisis and the need for adaptation. So, and now I would like to hear from our Vice Chair.
Thank you. Just in that issue, I just wanted, before stating that, to recall that under Article 6, we have a very clear mandate to set up this multilateral crediting mechanism, because it's not any institution that set up, it's a multilateral one. More than 2,000 countries together mandated us to set up this one based on the Paris Agreement. And they wanted a very robust and credible mechanism that aimed to be a benchmark setter. It's not competing with other standards. We want to set up this one based on the mandate we have received to be this benchmark setter. And we will do our best as a supervisory body to follow that mandate. Just in coming now on the financial issue, in addition to what was said by Olga, we need to know that it was demonstrated that having these carbon pricing instruments, including this crediting mechanism, is one of the best way to tackle climate change and ensure emission reductions by allowing a cost-effective way to ensure that, and the mechanism aims to do so. And also, in addition to that, when it comes to adaptation, we have this contribution to adaptation by this mechanism. It's voluntary in the other mechanisms, but this one is mandatory. Just not the 5%, but we have, in addition to the 5%, we have also some funds that can come from the administrative fees that will be directed to the adaptation fund, as well as the surplus that can be directed that. So we consider that this mechanism can provide financial funding to the adaptation fund, to the adaptation in general, but also have a most cost-effective way to address emission reduction by any participating entity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bai. Now we're going to hear from our colleague from Singapore. So Rui, what is it from a buyer perspective, the potential there?
Yeah, the potential of Article 6.4 as a centralized mechanism under UNFCCC is that it provides a form of standard, which Mbai said, that help to set the benchmark. And private sector as well as governments can leverage this mechanism to make mitigation activities more bankable by providing a new stream of revenue to supplement. It may not need to focus largely on the carbon credit revenue, but it could help to supplement it and form a part of the blended financing mechanism. So, and this is in turn where the host party's approval and authorization will be needed. And it also will help to provide the financial institutions, the investor, that comfort level that they may need to recognize the units and or the pipeline of units as collateral to lower the cost of capital. So with or without the authorization, the value will actually change. So of course, in the view of blended financing mechanism, then it will be, of course, the best for the host parties to provide clarity on authorization upfront so that the cost of capital could be priced in much earlier. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Rui. And Sonam, from the perspective of Bhutan?
Okay, I'll not touch on the other things that speakers before me have said, but I just want to think, while the possibilities of funding is there, we also, just want to refer to a World Trade Organization paper on carbon pricing. Interestingly, which I think, at least I didn't know, though I've been involved in this process for some time, is that there are about 70 different carbon pricing schemes and all, So this is where, again, while we see the mechanism as a means of raising funds, funding, for scaling up funding, is that we may need to find a way of either do we need a global pricing carbon framework. I don't add a new dimension to the ongoing negotiation, but just want to see that, because otherwise, if you have 70 different carbon pricing schemes and many players, and the rule of economics is very clear, the more competition you have, it can drive prices down, So instead of seeing scaling up funding, we might see a race to the bottom. Hopefully not, but just a caution. But again, sharing from my national perspective is this, that one way we've seen upscaling funding is, in our carbon policy, we have this, that when you do a corresponding adjustment, the government will charge you a fee, So this is where we see one avenue of how you can raise funding, and also this is from my just national perspective on what could be the possibilities of raising funds beyond the SOP and so on and so on. Thank you.
Super interesting. Thanks for that, Sonam. And Ritika, from the perspective of South Pole, wow, you have the big picture, right? And we are all eager to know what is it, the outlook.
Sure. Thank you. I think there are 2 points that I would like to share. First, for Article 6.4 mechanism, and I think on this table and perhaps in this room we agree that it is a mechanism that can support scaled up climate finance towards projects and mitigation in general. For it to deliver on that scaled climate finance expectation, from our perspective, Article 6.4 mechanism should be available should be as broad-based as possible in terms of its use and purposes, right? It should be available for all purposes as far as possible to allow for broadest acceptance by different carbon market participants. For us, that means that the mechanism and the resulting A64ERs may be used for both compliance and voluntary purposes, as was the case with the CTM, right? And I think the decision from last year on adding the new nomenclature of mitigation contribution ERs then is a welcome one from that perspective, because it creates that space. Our interpretation of that of that decision is that these units or these mitigation contribution A64ERs can be used for voluntary purposes as well, for corporates to then use to do mitigation beyond their value chain, right? Perhaps a clarification in that regard that may be helpful is that we don't need to seek authorization if one is trying to sort of to capture mitigation contribution ERs versus the authorized A64 ERs. Perhaps that's a clarification that will be useful for us from the supervisory body. And then perhaps if I can zoom out, and this is not perhaps a particularly an Article 6.4 mechanism issue, but for carbon markets to thrive, and for carbon project developers to go and develop projects, policy predictability and certainty is key, right? And it's great to see that that governments are now stepping in, and they're actually taking charge of developing rules of engagement, and that's a really welcome step. It is needed, and it actually to carbon market participants, it shows it shows taking responsibility for their NDCs, which is a positive thing. What is perhaps something to think about is that we need these rules to actually facilitate participation rather than hinder it. And for project development, I mean, as a company that invests in carbon projects, that takes the risk of putting upfront finance, having clarity on what rules are going to come from the host country government, and how certain those rules would be, for example, things around authorization, and whether authorization would remain or could it get revoked at some point, right? Would it be, at what point does it happen? Could it happen yearly? Some of these things create some uncertainties, right, in terms of how revenue streams from these projects can be planned. So these are things that could help in ensuring that the mechanism do actually scale, that it has the avenues that are needed for it to scale, knowing that there is potential for the mechanism to provide finance at scale.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ridika, for that. And Jonathan, from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I think just to tie back to the previous part on additionality, actually, I think that's an important part here, because it's not just scaling of finance to mitigation activities, but mitigation activities that rely on carbon finance to be set up. So I think, again, having the additionality rules here well-defined is an important part, or else it's sort of a misallocation of resources. And also, I think, tying back to having ambitious baselines and additionality rules, it might mean that there are fewer credits overall, but there might be a premium for those credits, because if the rules are rigorous, there will be trust in that. There will be better demand for that. So actually, fewer credits does not necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. It could lead to higher prices, which could reach the ground. But again, for this to reach the ground and support these projects, there needs to be transparency on the whole financial cycle with carbon credits. And this is a massive problem on the voluntary market, for instance, at the moment. I mean, it's almost impossible to know how much money from revenue from the sale of carbon credits actually goes to supporting projects on the ground versus how much is sort of captured by various intermediaries along the value chain. So Carbon Market Watch had done a report into this with Allied Offsets, and had looked at 125 different intermediaries, finding that only 9 out of 10 did not disclose their profit margins or fees or details like that. So it's actually almost impossible to know how much money goes to the ground, and especially the amount of finance that would go to local communities when they are involved in a crediting project. This is something that is really not transparent. So some ways to address this could be to require developers to sort of publish an annual financial report that discloses sort of some of the costs and revenues, including mandatory disclosure of how much revenue from the crediting actually goes to supporting local communities when they're involved in projects. Those are some concrete ideas. Also, benefit sharing agreements that might be in place. These are usually not public on the voluntary market, so it's very hard to know actually if it's a fair deal that has been struck or not. So there's a lot of issues there that I think the supervisory body should take an active role in setting a high bar for standard. So yeah.
Very much, and I think that the level of note-taking from both Olga and Bai, I think that shows that these are really interesting ideas that you put in on the table. Now we're going to move to our last but not least question. James pointed at the beginning how high quality and highly environmental integrity, how important these are, but also the social value of the entire mechanism and its outcomes. It's very important. We need to build a solid mechanism that doesn't have negative impact on the people in terms of human rights and environmental rights. So now I'm going to ask, if I may, for a bit of shorter answers, because we are running out of time and we want to hear from the audience. So from your perspective, how can the Article 6.4 mechanism contribute to sustainable development? It's a big question, but if I may ask you for rather short answers. Olga, please.
Well, we have already mandated in our previous decision and the previous meeting the use of sustainability tool and making sustainability assessment mandatory as part of the project cycle. We also, the focus really is on measures that would help to develop sustainability sectors. And the focus, there'll be absolutely necessity to assess the co-benefits of the mitigation actions that the mechanism would support. So I'll stop here, because I know my buyer would probably say it even more eloquently than I can.
Yeah, thank you. Just to recall that under the CDM, it was one of the most important criticism we had when it comes to sustainable development issue, where we had a tool which was voluntary. In this one, the Article 6 will be a mandatory, and we are working on that. It's a very clear mandate we received to have a mandatory sustainable development tool. And in addition to that, the host country will be more involved in this new mechanism as it was under the CDM, and will take into account all the elements in relation to its sustainable development when authorizing the participation from the project proponent in this mechanism. And lastly, it's the first time, and it was in Paris Agreement, that human rights as well as the indigenous people rights have been noticed in this one. And that will be also being taken into account when building this mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbaye. From the perspective of Singapore, Ryu.
Yep, thank you. So actually, through the implementation of Article 6.4 mitigation activities, it will already contribute to sustainable development, such as green growth opportunities, improvement to quality and standard of living, and better access to essential services. So it's really up to the host parties to put in place additional measures to ensure safeguards and direction of the resources to the priority areas of the host country in terms of sustainable development. And lastly, I just want to add on to the point that Mbaye said just now about SOP, where Article 6.4 already put in place SOP component for adaptation, which is something that Article 6 needs to do in terms of advancing both mitigation and adaptation ambition. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Sonam, please.
This sustainable development is interesting. I mean, while the requirements are there in Article 6 in the mechanism, I just want to point that sustainable development is also about the free flow of trade around the world, right? This is the whole multilateral approach. And just a perspective on this is that we do see certain challenges to this, right? One, you want high quality credits, but if you raise the technical barriers to participate in the markets. It might leave a large number of countries, the developing countries, out of this, as well as we have new instruments that are beyond Article 6, like the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. These could be detrimental to the participation of parties or countries in the mechanism. And then this raises the question of, are we really achieving the sustainable development goals? And I mean, if you look at the SDGs, there's the right to livelihood, decent work, trade and industry, and this requires a multilateral approach. So I think this is where we have to really think beyond just the mechanism to achieve sustainable development. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Sonam. Yeah, now from the perspective of our experts watching and working with the private sector, what are, Ritika, the contributions to sustainable development that can be foreseen?
Sure. I'll probably keep it brief. I think perhaps, I mean, I agree. I agree with the panelists that sustainable development was sort of a pain point for the CDM, right? But at the same time, in the last 15, 16 years, independent standards have worked have worked and developed a huge body of evidence around how to assess sustainable development, how to measure it, around processes and around processes, operative definitions, and an assessment of sustainable development benefits as well as safeguards. Perhaps from our perspective, it would be great to actually use that literature as in the discussions for the supervisory body in their own sort of in their own deliberations around how this new mechanism could measure sustainable development. Keeping, of course, in mind that sustainable development is and it continues to be a host country prerogative. So perhaps those the real operative definitions will come from countries themselves. But the processes can certainly improve.
Thank you, Ritika. From Jonathan, from your perspective, what could be the safeguards that we could install to avoid a negative impact? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think I would echo first, the fact that under the CDM it was voluntary. That was a definite problem, so it should be mandatory if projects also want to claim sustainable development co-benefits. And I think this also, of course, needs to be required upon on the verification process upon registration and upon renewal of crediting periods, and perhaps that could be at faster intervals as well, because for removal projects it's 15 years, so it would need to happen more than just every 15 years. And I think also part of this is to ensure that potential negative impacts are also taken into account and factored and reviewed as part of the review process by the DOEs or VVBs, however it would be, to be sure that free, prior, informed consent is upheld, and other safeguards that may be defined. And just on this, I think that it's really important for the supervisory body to design these environmental and social safeguards in dialogue with communities that might actually be impacted by these projects, so local communities and indigenous peoples. I think there needs to be a much greater effort for the supervisory body to engage with these stakeholders, especially in designing these safeguards, as well as the independent grievance process, which is mandated, because they may be the ones who would need to have recourse to these systems, and so they should be involved in that discussion, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that, and thank you very much to all our panelists for those insights and the good ideas. Now we're going to open the floor for questions. We already have 1, 2, 3, many hands up, and I would kindly like to ask a colleague at the back if there is a second handheld mic. I will hand out mine, but if could you please say your name and the organization that you represent? It will be great. So I think you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. Axel Michaelova from Perspectives Climate Research at University of Zurich. I very much welcome the statement by James that Article 6.4 mechanism should have unparalleled standards of environmental integrity. The initiative for creation of Article 6 methodology tools has submitted tools to operationalize additionality determination to ensure ambitious baselines. We've seen that these submissions, and of course from others as well, have led to very, let's say, I would say controversial discussions within the Article 6.4 supervisory body. So I would ask the panel, how do you envisage now to really come on this path of these unparalleled standards of environmental integrity? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I may ask any Olga Mbai, you would like to take that one?
Yeah, I can start, and maybe Olga will complement. As you know, it's a mandate we have already received with very clear guidance coming from the CMA on how to build this mechanism in terms of environmental integrity, broad participation, baseline, and all of that, already very clear. And as you have seen, we are taking into account all inputs received from all stakeholders. Our meetings are public, and we assess all input we receive, including the one you are talking about. And at the end of the day, a decision will be taken. And to respond to our mandate, I agree with you that for many elements, we have some controversial discussions in relation to that, based on the different views coming from different type of stakeholders and different concerns. We have to take all of that into account, and we think at the end of the day, the recommendation will be made by the supervisory body in terms of developing methodology as well as addressing specific methodology on removals will address the concern of the broader stakeholders and ensure, and that is the most important thing, the environmental integrity, bearing in mind also that whatever will be done, will be proposed, is a dynamic process and may be improved in the future. Thank you. Olga.
Thank you very much, Mbaye, and I apologize. Mbaye is far more eloquent than I am, so I think to answer this question, we have talked a lot already about environmental integrity, and as to the discussions we have, we are there to be, we feel the weight of the UN logo. We are absolutely striving to be the best, and we are also striving to achieve. We're striving to make the difference, right? We're striving to make a difference in the world. And that is really their cooperation, the cooperative approach that we are. That's what we need to be. And we are working very hard on that. We have, of course, disagreements, and the disagreements on how, there are always disagreements on the ways to do things. But it's important for us to operationalize this mechanism. And I think that's a goal that all of the members share.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. And we had a lady. Thank you, Judith. Yeah.
I cannot see the panel, so I'll just stand. I'm Asami Segundo. I'm an indigenous person from the Philippines, and I'm part of the IP caucus. I'm representing the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program, Asia. A while ago, you've been telling that we want the Article 6.4 mechanism to be inclusive. And I just want to ask what has been the steps that the SB is taking to ensure the inclusion of indigenous peoples in the setting of the mechanism. Another question is that you have also been mentioning that the host country will be very much be involved in this mechanism. But sometimes, like in my country, the government and the indigenous peoples may be different entity. So my question is, how involved will be the indigenous peoples in this mechanism that we're setting up?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So please, a very interesting question that has to do a lot with...
Thank you very much. Thank you for this question, because we are planning to work on the concept of how we are to incorporate indigenous community into the work of 6.4 SB and the functioning of the mechanism. That is, we have a separate mandate for that, and that is coming. But we also want to be very open and to to create avenues to work with the stakeholders, all of the stakeholders, including indigenous peoples, by providing opportunities for communication, and also providing opportunities for input from the local communities into the project activities, into the methodologies, into the work of this bee. So this is clearly our goal, and we're very open to work with indigenous peoples on that.
Mm-hmm. And on the second question from the friend from the Philippines about how are we going to work with the countries in terms that the criteria that they apply are also taking indigenous people into account, if there is some line of work in that direction?
Yes, in any case, a project proponent can't submit a project to the supervisory body without the authorization of the host country. And it's up to the host country to define the internal process through which that country will deliver that authorization to participate in the mechanism. We, as supervisory body, we will define the framework to take into account that, but it will be within the country that the specific elements will be taken into account. But at any time, you need to bear in mind that in the project cycle, there will be a stakeholder consultation. And the result of that consultation will be taken into account when the verification of the project will be done by a third party before registration of the project or a program. Thank you.
Very much. And before we have a question here, the first row, please.
Thank you. Yes, Arthur Lee. I'm with the International Emissions Trading Association on the board of directors, although I'm not speaking on behalf of AITA. I just want to ask the question about how fast do you think the scale-up question, how fast do you think the 6.4 can really scale up these projects? Because 1.5 degrees is going to be there soon. So how fast can we do it? I know we have a lot of concerns about environmental integrity and indigenous folks and all of that, but how fast can we do it? For example, CDM methodologies, we talked about CDM a little bit here already. Can you high grade some of the CDM methodologies that are already high quality and just bring them over to 6.4? So these are kind of questions that are really concerning for me and my organizations about how fast you can do this.
Thanks. Thank you.
Well, our goal is really to operationalize, and that's very, very important for us. In terms of how fast we can bring the methodologies, I know that the preparations are there. And we are laying all the groundwork, all of the sort of expert capacity and administrative capacity that will be needed to deliver. So I cannot give you a date, but it's very much a focus, and we're trying to do it as much as as quickly as possible, without, of course, and that I have to underline, without undermining the environmental integrity, because that's also very important. So we can't just take methodologies and adopt them in 6.4. We will have to review them. We will have to review the adequacy, the science behind them, to what extent, they correspond to the current conditions. That process will need to happen. But the background work that's needed for it, we're working very hard on it.
Okay.
Just to add something, we, in parallel, have started to work on all the project cycle to have ready all the procedures that are needed, in addition to the development of methodology as well as the removal. That meaning that if we have a decision coming from the CMA in those elements in relation to the principle for the development of methodology as well as for the removals, all the elements will be already in place to make the mechanism being operational. And in addition to that, we have received also from some stakeholders some tools to refine CDM methodologies into 6.4 methodology, taking into account the mandate we already received. And if you have seen our work, when we start to present some rules, we at the same time test them in some CDM methodology to see how that can be worked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, because we have only 5 minutes left, we are going to we're going to take a couple of questions all together. So please be brief in your question. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Silvia Ribeiro from ETC Group. It's an environmental social NGO. And I have two questions. One is, this convention was born together with the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's one of the Rio Conventions. And the Convention on Biological Diversity has a moratoria on several of the technologies that you are considering as removals because of their impacts on biodiversity and communities. So how are you going to have that in the question of environmental integrity? And the second question is, about this is about stakeholder consultations. And as you are aware, several of us in NGOs and others and indigenous peoples following these discussions, we are not pleased with this recent consultation on 2 weeks. And we manifested that before. We think that is really very short to have serious inputs. But the most concerning issue is when you think about the future cycles, this is an impossible time for consulting really the impacted communities, the communities that will really have the worst impacts. So how are you going to take that into account? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to take another one, maybe at the back. Yeah, please. And then if there is any more, another one, last question, before we go to the last round of answers by the panelists. Okay, if not, this one will be the last one. Yeah.
Okay, so one more.
Please. Yes. No? Yes. Please.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Hi, I'm from the University of Oxford. We had a panel of IPCC scientists on Monday who told us that the ability of the biosphere to compensate or offset our emissions rapidly decreases as the climate warms. We've seen that most recently in the actual world with the burning of the Canadian forests at the moment. How are you taking into account questions of permanence and durability, especially over time as the climate is warming? Thank you.
Well, these are big questions. I think we will need another side event for just this last one. Yeah, so we have 3 questions here. Convention on Biodiversity moratoria, community consultations in a very short time, and the issue of permanence and durability. So I think these questions are all addressed to both of you, so I'm very sorry for the rest of the panelists. Please, Olga.
I think I'll answer the question of stakeholder consultation. It's very close to my heart, because I really appreciate working with our stakeholders. The 2 weeks specifically on that consultation that was announced now, we had really very little freedom because we have a meeting coming up just in 3 weeks. So we needed to give Secretariat time to compile the inputs from the stakeholders. But we were very clear that we will accept late submissions and we will consider them. We also will, we will conduct 2 additional stakeholder consultation sessions between the meeting we just had and the coming meeting. So we were also very, very clear about that. I think on the CBD question, obviously we would need to consider the interaction, and there is a component of our work that addresses environmental safeguards, but it's also very clear that there is science and progress in science, and we need to take that into account. I'm not sure, maybe I forgot something, but
just to add that in any case, when it comes to that issue of biodiversity, we know the impact of climate change on biodiversity and vice versa, and the different conference, COP27, as well as the COP15, have clearly addressed that issue. But we are open to any input because as you have seen, we always call for input, and all comments or inputs are considered within the supervisory body. So we are open to that. And lastly, when it comes to the last question on permanence and durability, we are working on that, and you have seen on removals, it's one of the mandates we have received. We have received a very clear guidance on elements to be considered when it comes to removals, and we are addressing both nature-based removals as well as technology-based removals. And for both of them, there are different ways to address them, and the recommendation we'll make for the CMA 5 will take into account all those elements. Thank you.
I indeed forgot about the last question, so I just add what I wanted to add is that you will need to tune in to our meetings and watch the webcast to find out how we solve it.
So yeah, it's all there on the archive, and it is. I myself tuned in last week, and I found it extremely insightful, but also amazingly complex. And I'm very happy that we have this opportunity at this unique side event. Thank you very much to the chair and vice chair of the supervisory body for taking the time and answer these questions. But we have an announcement, so please don't wrap up yet. So stay seated, because I want to, of course, to thank the representative from Bhutan, from Singapore, and of course the representative from the South Pole and Carbon Market Watch. Thank you very much, Ritika. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Bai. Thank you, Sonam, Jonathan, and Rui. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. And before you go, we have an announcement, and it's that the conversation, of course, that we just heard, is open through several channels. So apart from watching the webcast and inputting when consultations are made, please, Olga, would you like maybe to describe what are these new 4 channels of communications that you're opening up now?
Yes, we have received a lot of questions from stakeholders and requests to improve our communications. So we are launching a mailing list so that you can receive updates and notifications when something is published, when we make announcements. There's also a dedicated new email where you can get in touch with us. As I mentioned already, there will be webinars coming up, so you'll need to get sign up to the mailing list to be informed on when they will be announced. And the Secretariat is planning shortly to launch a LinkedIn group on Article 6. So please watch the space, and we'll try our best to make you as informed as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olga. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.